Be afraid to get close.
It's all good. I'm used to... Again, I've also been on the podcast foray as well. We'll talk about it in a minute.
Of course, here we go.
Lovely.
So, welcome Adam Ray to the BTS Creative Academy Podcast. We're here at Thought Bubble. Just to let you know, this episode has been sponsored by Supernova Media. They support storytellers. So they've brought me here to the Thought Bubble Festival to meet creatives, which is what I do. I meet creatives and I explore their journeys. And I've just met you, Adam. So tell me a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Well, creatives are people that definitely love to just make things and put things out there, and they're definitely my favorite kind of people. I don't really know how to socialize with anyone who doesn't do that, or the general nerd fare. I'd say an easy way to describe myself is I'm a victim of my horrendous ADHD diagnosis. I probably have too many irons in the fire, and I just like to make things. So for the most part, the thing that's brought me here to Thought Bubble today is my nerd news writing in affiliation with Dark Knight News, one of the largest Batman news websites in the world.
Wow.
As well as my own website that I started with my late father, fantasticuniverses.com, where we do a lot of general nerd news and pop culture opinion pieces and reviews. So being able to come to an event like this to rub shoulders and talk to creative comics professionals of every level, whether it's like the people in charge of the storylines at Marvel and DC, as well as the up-and-coming independents who have just poured their heart and souls into just really unique art and just delicious little stories. That's definitely an environment that I just love to be in, and just to get some insight and make sure that their work is spread far and wide as best as I can, with the intent, hopefully, to have some of my own fiction work on the side be in there eventually one day.
Tell me a little bit more about the way that you're covering this event, as you're here as press. You're here with your newsletter and your websites. Tell me, and you're a creative yourself, tell me what that's like to be here.
I've been working the convention circuit for a good long while. I've been involved with Dark Knight News since 2018. So I've worked at some of the larger central London conventions, and that was just always an opportunity to go in with some comics to get signed, just so that I have an easy point of conversation with a lot of these creators. But then to sort of naturally get the conversation going around them, just to remind them that we're appreciative of their work, and to sort of inquire politely as best you can about what they've been involved in, what they're working on next, what they loved about the stuff that you're getting signed from them, what they would have done better perhaps, because creation like that is a process. You have to really respect the fact that it's all, you don't just sneeze and the perfect story comes out. You have to iterate on it. You have to draft it, edit, re-edit, retouch some of the artwork if you're still in the art stages. So there's definitely an element of real iteration and just trying to work your best efforts that you possibly can to make something as well-rounded so that it can be appreciated by all of the people at a big event just like this. So that's what I enjoy doing. I like giving that level of care and attention back so that people can see the process behind it, but still really love and respect the people that put their heart and soul into the things they want to make.
So I'm quite new to this industry, press, if we're going to kind of put it under one banner. I've lived a very creative life myself, and I'm kind of wondering what that does for the creatives, you exploring their media, exploring their comic books, sharing it, writing about it. What do you think it does for them?
I think it's an important level of validation to recognize that there are people out there that read and watch your stuff very closely, as well as doing some of the creative, analytical nerd news work that I do. I also put out my podcast in an audio drama. My partner, some friends, and I, we record our Dungeons and Dragons games, and then I edit them down so that they listen like an audio drama. And we had the rare fortune of going through the interview process for another cast member, and one of the people, the interviewees, was so on the ball, had listened very closely, and knew all of the story beats very well. So that was a very gratifying moment for us, just to know that they had listened that intensely and was just that appreciative and following along the story. So being able to bring that level of love and appreciation back, I think, is a very important sort of badge of honor to show the creative, yes, you've done a good job, you're loved and you're respected. But also in terms of the actual analytical review side of things, especially coming from my my English literature degree side and education, it's important to be able to critique in a way so that you can recognize shortcomings and present them in a way that doesn't demoralize the creator, because especially young up-and-comers, they might take it personally. That might really knock their confidence or even get them out of the game altogether, which is a crying shame.
I've always considered myself with this that I'm a commentator and not a critic.
Exactly.
I recently went to the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, and there people they were asking me for their review, for their opinion, and I was trying to give it in a way that was more of a comment than a critic, because a lot of the people entering this industry in these places at these festivals, they are new.
Yeah.
And they need encouragement, and not everyone's going to be doing the perfect, shiny, finished product yet. They're going to be developing something, and they're going to be in their building stage, aren't they?
Exactly right.
So we've got to tread carefully with how we approach them, haven't we?
Definitely, yes. If you're able to frame your critiquing in a way so that it's constructive to say why it wasn't effective and encourage them to do better in a way so that you can provide ways that clearly show the insight as to what can be improved upon, that's definitely the right way to do it. Certainly the ethos for the website my father and I founded, Fantastic Universes, we try our best to put positive spins on everything. And even in our criticisms, we want to say where it fell short, but not with the intention of badgering down. There's so much mass media in the world of reviews where they'll just badmouth things and just say that it's bad and list all of the reasons they didn't like about it. But there's no conversation there. There's no criticism there. There's no willingness to want to improve there. I personally avoid that kind of discourse. I have no time for it. That's also why I don't really watch mainstream news as well, because that's literal doom and gloom. It's so important to own that nothing will be perfect, even a finished product. Someone will find a typo in a published novel that sold millions of copies. But as long as you're willing to say why it fell short and what can be done to make it better, that's how discourse should be, especially in a creative media just like this.
I wonder if it's different for us because we're creatives. You talked about mainstream media there and how it's all doom and gloom. And when they're covering things like any form of art or entertainment, the people covering it may not understand or appreciate what actually has gone into that creation. They've just seen the finished product.
Yeah.
Whereas us, we live part of this life, so we know the process, we know the struggle that's gone into it, and no matter what the finished product looks like, there is a trail of work behind them as well.
Oh, definitely, yeah. I think the best metaphor I ever heard for it was back when I was studying my creative writing degree as well. It's not about showing up at the page, pouring your heart out, and it just shows up perfect. I think the only writer that's ever done that historically was Conan Doyle. His original drafts for Sherlock Holmes went through very few rewrites historically. That's just a fact. For everyone else, it's more of a case of being a sculpture at a huge block of granite. You have to iterate on it. You have to chip away at it. Sometimes you will mess up, and you've got to refix and reshape things yourself, and then the finished product might not be how you imagined it. That also reminds me of, again, showing how out there my influences are. One of the things that really inspired me to start writing fiction back when I was a kid was the video game Alan Wake by Remedy. There was one metaphor that the main character sort of talked about, because the main character was a horror writer whose horror story started coming to life, one of my favorite games of all time. He talked about when you start a creative piece of work, writing, art, music, what have you, you start knowing what you want to make and you go into it and you start making freely. But then it gets to a point where you have to start giving the piece of art what it wants. You have to start shaping things in such a way so that the through line of the story still makes sense based on everything you said before. And you'll find that the characters, if they're written well, their motivations will start to shine through. So you have to keep them on where they're going, even though you might have initially thought that the story might go in a different direction. I have a few friends who are musicians who definitely say that. If they're trying to compose a long piece, they wanted to try and bring the bridge forward, but the song didn't need that. It needed more time to breathe, and then it gets to final notes.
I do a lot of theatre, and when I'm producing and directing theatre, I start with a script, but the script isn't what the finished product is, and different people can interpret that initial thing in a different way.
Oh, definitely.
And that's one of the things I love about theatre, is that you can see, and this is why Shakespeare's been around for so long, is because everyone can take the same piece of text and do a million different things with it. It's all in the personal sculpting, isn't it?
Definitely true, especially with Shakespeare. I'd seen some friends do a very small amateur dramatic performance of Macbeth in the back of a local theatre near where I grew up. And they decorated everything to feel like it was World War II, and everything was very intimate and gritty, but still beautiful. But then I went to the Globe Theatre to see a recent production where they recast the witches as men, and the cauldron was a blender, and the tone was all over the place. So that's definitely true, because the writing there, the original
is the core.
It's the core, but for theatre productions, you can dress it up around it, and that becomes a finished product. So up until that point, I didn't think you could do that text badly, but that's just sort of showing the creative process around it. You need to handle every element to make sure that everything is as strong as it could be.
So going back to yourself, where did this kind of all start for you, that you started to get into this position of reviewing and commentating on what we're here for today, comic books?
Well, I'll mention my father quite a bit, because he's definitely one of those big influences on me. He has had an uninterrupted collection of detective comics going back to 1979. And he had been collecting comics up until the week that he had passed away of cancer. So he passed away in the July recently, which was like still very raw and very real. But from that early age in my entire upbringing, he had been consistently filling my mind with stories, giving me the formative years of Batman since I was a kid, reading me light-hearted stories like the Harry Potter novels, and he'd done voice acting here and there, so he was able to really get the performance out of it. So I'd always been surrounded by good stories and good music and just a general curiosity for life. Between that and my education going towards learning what makes a good story and how well to structure it, that led me to want to unpack why things work. I like tinkering with things. I've won a few awards when I was a kid for Lego master building. So just little fine-tuning and nitty-gritty things are always very exciting to me. So wanting to see the review side on comics was just a natural fit. So I started writing in and around Dark Knight News, very large fan following for Batman, official DC licensed website. We get sent comics by them every month just so that we have them on day of release. And because comics are such a huge creative process where so many different collaborators all handle one story, because people just think it's like writer-artist. No. There's people who do the initial sketches. There's people who do the coloring. There's people who do the levels of shading. There's people who do the ink so that the bolds and the outlines all work well. And it's a point of personal pride that I always try to shout out how well letterers do in my reviews, because they are unsung heroes, because they don't just do like the text boxes and the speech bubbles. They make it so that it is not intrusive to the art, but it also, depending on how well they're spaced out, it sort of guides the direction of the story. And I could see it done okay in like Eastern style comics, like translations of manga, where the speech bubbles are still huge because it's translated from the Japanese. But it still contains the story elements along. But there are parts of me that's grown up reading DC where I'm like, oh, if you just like shrink that down, you get so much more of the art and you'd be able to like flow with the story more. But I forgive it for it's a different style of storytelling, so it has its own merits there as well. But there are so many hands and so many minds that goes toward like creating a comic that comes out every week in your local store. Also, as someone who's worked in many, support your local comic book stores. Don't just order them online. It's such a huge like mixing pot of different kinds of creative elements and creative personalities that you don't see in other media. With like movies and TV, sure, you'll get the combination of the actors, the directors, and the editors, but there'll always be some corporate stooge just like putting tropes back in, putting like flashy glitz back in so that it looks good on trailers and it'll sell tickets. Comics are still a very free, very personal form of creative storytelling, which is why events like Thought Bubble are so amazing, because you get the people that are setting the tone for DC and Marvel right now. Chip Zdarsky's just left Detective Comics, and now Detective Comics is up in the air as to who's going to write it, because Jim Lee's a bit all over the place, but still a creative genius. We can hope for the best, but when you see people that big rubbing shoulders with people that I know personally that have just had an idea, illustrated it themselves, independently published them themselves, and have run the Kickstarter route just to try and get things off the ground, that level of creativity is so hard to find, and it's so easy to overlook and like boo and naysay that you have to respect it. But at least for me personally, I think the only place other than comics that's still free and open for creative outlet is podcasting. But still, both mediums are very crowded and very directed. But you can tell literally any kind of story through comics as long as the team that's working on it is just well-rounded, and that's just always so very exciting to me.
Have you any idea why it is? You spoke at the beginning about being neurodivergent with ADHD. I myself am discovering things about that with me recently. I remember when I was young, I really struggled to read until I was in my teens.
I still have that trouble myself.
But I was clearly dyslexic, but the school never picked up on it. But comic books were the only format of storytelling that I could engage with and that could take my imagination to another place, another realm. And I was so keen every weekend my granddad used to bring me comic books every weekend.
Brilliant.
And I would always look forward to it. I knew that there was a new story to discover every weekend, but I couldn't get that with books. And it was different with films in some way as well. But with comic books, it just ignited something in my mind and my imagination. Why do you think it works for us neurodivergent people?
I think neurodivergent people, we have like a sort of tendency to like think about our thinking, so we get a little bit caught up with like pure prose and novels. That's certainly the way it is for me personally. I think it's also a case of that being mixed media, there's always something to sort of take in. You can loosely follow the story of a comic if it's just purely beautiful artwork. There's so many like silent comics out there, like Step by Bloody Step, where it captures you, the beautiful story of it, if it's just all artwork. But the mixture of like good artwork with well-handled text, which is why lettering is so important, in my opinion, that you can really follow the story along, and it's its own thing where you're consistently engaged with it, with the perfect blend of well-written story, well-written on the page text, and beautiful artwork. There's always something to like grip you and keep you involved and moving you through the story. I think that's why as a medium it's still so strong, with DC and Marvel having their origins going back to the 30s and the 40s, well over 100 years of storytelling at this point. We can sort of trace that back. Like, this is going to sound so artsy and pretentious.
No, go for it. That's what we're here for.
I know, but like that form of storytelling where it's like all visual and flowing around, that's like cave paintings of Lascaux. That's like old school caveman paintings of just like following moving pictures.
So it's in us. It's almost innate, isn't it? It's almost something that we, it's deep in our psyche that's been passed down. That this is how we should tell stories with mixed media. That it shouldn't essentially just be just words or just pictures, but bringing the two things together. And actually, I never considered that before now about you saying about the wording, and I'm starting to think now that maybe I could read so well from comic books is because of the way the wording was structured different.
Yeah, it's
because of the structure of that speech within the comic, and maybe a tiny little bit of narrative that was going on, but it was mainly that speech that helped something flow in my mind.
Oh, definitely, because even if you have a character sort of waxing lyrical about like their grand villainous plan, or like a detective type like unpacking the mystery in a way that's still satisfying, if you're able to like put like 2-3 sentences to one bubble, 2-3 sentences to another, and it structures down the page with something really beautiful to just sort of show the character sort of speaking. You get the sense that it's like a conversation. If the writing's concise enough, but the visuals are still beautiful, you feel like you're in the scene, listening to it, hearing it like theatre almost. I certainly know that an influence that, again, my father would have put on me was that whenever we were reading like Batman together, or whenever you would like give me a Batman story, I would always hear the voice work of Kevin Conroy from the animated series in the back of my mind, just sort of as Batman, and like Mark Hamill's Joker and all of those classic characters. So when the media is that good, that other things that it's inspired by still pay tribute to it, and it inspires you and influences how well you listen back to it, it's really magic, and you can't get that quite the same in other kinds of storytelling, which is why I've always certainly come back to comics. I can really relate to the struggle reading as well. I try my best, and I try to like write longhand in my journal just to sort of unpack my thoughts at the beginning and the end of every day, but like long form text still trips me up. But if it's a well-written comic, I will pick it up, I'll put it back down, and 5 hours has passed. And that's just the magic of a good story, as well as if it's well put together.
So we've touched on it a little bit about your family, your dad being a huge influence on you and with comic books, but what does that I'm going to go really deep here.
That's all good.
Yeah, what does that mean to you in the quality of your life that comic books has given to you?
I genuinely do not know, and don't really want to know what kind of person I would be without that influence, because it formed so much of my thinking. The first films I can remember seeing when I was a little kid were like old school sci-fis, like the first prequel of the Star Wars or Lost in Space. That then went on to me picking up like fantasy fiction and meeting some of my lifelong friends and my current partner through high fantasy experiences like Dungeons and Dragons, and then finding some serious friends and like professional level gaming through trading card games. So that level of influence and that level of creativity and that appreciation for really out there stories, I don't know who I am without those. But that's not a wall jumper I'm willing to like pull and untangle. That sounds really daunting. I'm very proud to say that I've been influenced by great stories my entire life, and I want to do my best at places like this to shine a light on the creatives behind those stories, and to hopefully be part of that conversation, because if those kinds of media could save my life and influence my life from the beginning, I know that someone out there might be a little bit lost, might be a little bit without direction, someone who didn't have what I have when they were growing up, and they feel very out there, and then they just pick up one story, read it, feel something in themselves, and be saved by it. That's a really magical moment that is really just life-affirming. Yeah. Especially with how miserable the outside world and the real world, quote unquote, can be sometimes.
So how do you feel being in this world, that this is part of your adult life now? Like, you know, we essentially pick up these comic books as kids, and I can't imagine if I went back to being like my 8-year-old self when I was reading comic books, that I'd be in a position like this here today, in the comic book world, living it. How does that feel for you?
It's incredibly life affirming, and the older I get, the more I believe in like fate and destiny and the like. It's like
Does it all make sense now?
It does.
It's almost like those things that happened to you when you were younger. The dots are now connecting.
It really does.
Yeah, wow.
Like, it really does, because like the longer time goes on, the more I do believe in that sort of like dots connecting, threads of fate sort of deal, which I really don't want to believe. I like to believe that we all can go and find our own directions and things, but it's just so rewarding to be around people like me who find wonderment in good stories, in good comics. And
the power of community.
The power of community. The power of a good community that is inclusive, that brings people together, that lifts people, that affirms them on the creative work that they want to do, on the curiosity they want to have, where, oh, I like this kind of story, I wonder where I find something else like it, or something else made by the same person. You could just talk to anyone else in line to the same artists and be like, okay, so what were they interested in? I actually found that today. I was speaking to Junie Barr, who wrote the excellent Boy Wonder miniseries, sort of putting a very poetic but still very sincere look on Damian Wayne as how he first arrived at Gotham and became a member of the Bat family. And just talking to someone else in the crowd who was getting some comics signed for his grandchildren, because that would be a perfect way to get them involved and to get them reading with bright characters, but still with like layered, nuanced stories. He told me a little bit about like this meaty, hardback graphic novel that Jimmy Barr had written and illustrated, all about Captain Nemo from 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. So that sort of a dialogue through time of just different kinds of stories influencing each other, but also different influencing generations of different kinds of readers. And I hope that gentleman's well. I lost him in the crowd, but that little like lightning in a bottle moment where someone was like, "Oh, that sounds like a good idea. I'll read that," just to keep that conversation alive, just to keep that wonderment and creativity alive that he gets to appreciate, that I get to find just by listening and engaging with nice people. That's the strength of the community in a place like this. That's the strength of good storytelling in a place like this. That's why we're all here. That's why we're all together.
Yeah. So what was your lightning in a bottle moment? What was your lightning in a bottle comic book? I know. It's just, for me, I knew what that was straight away when you said that.
Yeah,
for me, it was the death of Superman. That was my moment. That was my comic book that I read. It was different.
Yeah, John Byrne in the 80s.
Yes.
Historic, because the way it was structured, like the longer it went, the fewer and fewer panels it was. But you never noticed. That's just how well written and how well illustrated it was. Just to see, like, the story flowing over double page spreads, but it's all one piece of artwork. And again, that's just the quality of like the speech bubbles making your eyes follow across the page and across the story. But it just being this like one flowing movement until eventually it ends with the cape torn up on that spike. Beautiful storytelling. I can definitely agree.
And it's one of them comic books that I'm like, why have they not made that into a film yet? And you've tried to rip bits off, didn't they, in Batman versus Superman? But they didn't even begin to touch on it.
I think it's still too.
Do you think
perfect.
that's what it is?
I personally, I think so as well. That's why the animations are still quite strong, because they've done animations for stuff like Dark Knight Returns, and that was perfect. They did animations for Killer.
I noticed this, that the animation for DC is so much stronger than the films.
It's because they keep that all in house. They keep that where they can consult the original writers and artists as consultants. And they're literally on the other end of the phone, especially with the Dark Knight Returns stuff.
Whereas DC is such a separate entity.
Yeah.
I wonder with future DC, as we're moving into this James Gunn era, I wonder if that's going to be any different.
I can trust James Gunn to handle ensemble stories. I can trust James Gunn to handle...
Yeah, because clearly we've seen that with his work with Marvel, yeah.
Yeah, and with the new Suicide Squad with
yes,
with Idris Elba's Bloodsport. That was done very well. It's because they were able to keep the tone right. That's a whole other conversation, but I could definitely get into it on that. But as long as they draw more influences from like the actual set in stone great comic book stories, they really can't go wrong. But then again, we've seen that done so well with a lot of the original Zack Snyder stuff, not necessarily his hardline DC stuff, but stuff like Watchmen 300. That was beat for beat perfect. So to be able to respect what came before but still put their own spin on it, that could be pretty nice, as long as it's a personal gripe for me that they need to keep the casting consistent.
Yes.
Like, Ben Affleck did a fantastic job in the performance, but him being haggard is not correct. A lot of people really miss the fact that Bruce Wayne, Clark Kent, and Lex Luthor are all comparable ages, so that they can sort of grow together as allies and antagonists, and keep that level of like brinkmanship and relatable conflict together. Because even during the Death in the Family stuff, Superman was a big influence to try and keep Batman calm again. And you can only really get that if they're friends of a similar age and a similar generation, because they'd all met and formed the Justice League at the same time when they were still fairly new to the role but established. So if they're able to handle that and give that level of respect back, I think they're in a good spot.
So we went off on a bit of a tangent there, and that was my fault. I
That's
did
all right.
ask you about your lightning in a bottle moment, your comic book, and I went into my comic book.
No, that's just the joy of the comics. We can talk about it.
Exactly. Yeah, we
That's
can
all.
go off. Yeah.
We really
but
can.
no, I'm interested in you, Adam. I want to find out what it is for you.
I know exactly what it was. I was probably too young to have read it, but I read it anyway because, again, my father was a bad influence.
or a good
Definitely.
or a good influence.
Good bad influence.
Bad.
We'll get your thoughts on it. I think it was right around when the Watchmen film was coming out that he handed me the books, and I must have been 9-10 years old at the time, so it was like heavy, but I could handle it because I was always raised to say, yes, these are heavy stories, but they are stories. They will not hurt you. Nothing bad will happen to you. Just remember that they are a thing that someone has told for you to enjoy and for you to think about.
Well, it sounds to me like your dad prepped you for them stories. Your dad,
definitely.
you could hand Watchmen to a young child, a 6 or 8 year old who doesn't know what they're looking through, doesn't know what they're experiencing, and they can be disturbed by it.
That would mess a kid up.
Or there are some kids that are easily frightened as well, and some kids that overthink, and that might not be good for them.
Yeah.
But as a parent, I'm a parent myself, and I handed Watchmen to my son when he was 8 years old. I shared that with him because I knew that he could handle it and understand it, and it would enhance his imagination.
Yeah.
And I think that's important with things like this, that we don't just classify it as you get to a certain age, therefore you can read it. It's parental advisory.
No, definitely.
Parental guidance.
Definitely, yeah. And that's definitely the guidance I was given going into it, but the actual lightning in a bottle moment came a little after. After I'd read it, loved it, obviously, I was given Alan Moore's initial run of Swamp Thing. The middle volumes of the trades, just a little bit after the stuff that tied into Crisis in Infinite Earths, where he went on just deep philosophy about life's purpose, your own identity, what it means to be human, what it means to do the right thing when everyone else around you is being rewarded for doing the bad thing. That just set me on a really idealistic sort of personal belief that, sure, it's very easy to believe that people out there are selfish, will cut corners, will upset you just because, but there is still an element of goodness in people, and it's important to be good and do the right thing in the face of that negativity. And that's really influenced my whole thinking, as well as it being just visually beautiful, very trippy 80s artwork. It's something that sticks with me, and I haven't picked it up in a long time, and I think I might just, it's a personal favorite that really set me on the path of, yes, telling stories is very important to me, and telling stories that resonate with people and put my message that could be a little bit dour, but I don't want them to be, out into people's minds is just very important. So.
I think you've given a great example there of how we can often underestimate children and how important these stories are for them in their development. And to me, it sounds like you were the perfect age to read Watchmen at 8 years old, because of how it's helped transform you into the adult you are today.
Oh, definitely, yeah. I'm much older than I look, but definitely it's influenced my thinking so much, and it's influenced my curiosity and the way I approach people and the way I approach life. Everyone's going through a story. Everyone has their own struggles. Everyone's suffering in some way, so you have to be compassionate with it. You have to give them the patience. You have to be willing to listen. And if you want to learn something, it's okay to be unsure or make mistakes or ask quote-unquote silly questions, because how else do we learn? And giving other people that benefit of the doubt is just so important, because other people could blunder their way into stories and be confused by it or not really follow it, especially with how comic books are made these days with weekly issues. You pick something up off of the shelf and it's halfway through a storyline, halfway through a fight scene almost, just like, this is what I just learned about Spider-Man, what's going on? But that's okay too, because as long as you're willing to stick with it and stay with it, you will find wonderment, especially if you are directed by someone a bit more in the know, like the two of us, to some of the people here today, like my father was when I was younger. As long as you're able to see the merit in it and want to read around it and let yourself be curious enough to keep going with those stories, you'll definitely find something for you.
Well, Adam, this has been a wonderful conversation. I'm so pleased to have met you, and thank you for sharing your insights into the world of comic books. Just a final question then. We've talked a lot about the past. Let's go into the future on our final question. What are your hopes and dreams for this space in the future?
I think that the space is in a very strong spot. I think there's still a lot of creative license and creative freedom, even if the big two companies do have their profit margins and do have their readership quotas that they've got to worry about. There will always be someone downstairs dressed in bright colours with their own zany idea that wants to put their story to artwork. And as long as they're determined and as long as they have the encouragement from people like us who are willing to look and engage and offer feedback, as long as there's people out there willing to tell stories in this exciting new medium, there will always be stories, and there'll always be people like us eager to read good stories.
Wonderful. Well, thanks again, Adam. And if anyone was watching or listening, thank you for joining us for this episode of the BTS Creative Academy Podcast here at Thought Bubble. Thought Bubble? No. Bubble. Forgot how to speak there. Thanks again, Adam. I very much appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Lovely.
That was smashing.
Yeah, good. Well, there you go. Half an hour, 35 minutes.